Driving through Brookville about a week and a half ago, and you know how you go into a town and they've got their little signs, sometimes they have a slogan that goes with it. Well, Brookville says, the rush of relaxation. And I'd never noticed that before driving through. And my first thought was, oh my gosh, we can't even relax anymore unless it's fast-paced and rushed. Like that just fits our culture. And then I thought about it and I was like, well, maybe they mean the rush of relaxation, like the adrenaline and the experience of what it's like to slow down and relax. So I got on their website because I was curious what it said. And this was their write-up. When you click on Discover the Rush of Relaxation, it says, whether racing watercraft on the open sky canopy of Brookville Lake, taming the rapids of the valley's Whitewater River, digging your boots into the landscape's endless wooded trails, strolling the retail and festival streets of downtown, or stopping completely to appreciate one of the area's countless historic sites, Brookville has a unique way of keeping pace with you. And it goes on to talk about no schedules, no worries, just refreshing yourself on your own time. And I was like, that's a well-worded advertisement right there. Like, that has sold it to me. But what was it trying to sell? And I want to propose to you that ads like that are trying to sell Sabbath. And they're trying to sell it to you because they know that most people go through their lives not getting those things, and yet we desperately desire them. So when Jeff talked about last week how the average person sees 5,000 ads a day and how the ads target our desires, they try to stir something up within us to make a purchase or take a trip, whatever it is, I think that's what these advertisements are doing. They're brewing up in us this deep desire for soulful rest, for the kind of rest that absolutely restores us. Now the problem is, most of these advertisements are disconnected from everyday life. They don't fit reality for the normal person's experience. Most people are following one of two rhythms. Either they are working for the weekend. You can cue the great Loverboy song right there if you know that one, where every day is they're just looking forward to Saturday and Sunday so they can finally unplug and relax. Or you have the people that are working to the bone tirelessly just to experience a week or two of a vacation where they're off, but those closest to them, you're not fooling them. We know that you can be physically present, and yet your mind can be totally focused on something else, like work. And this is the problem in our culture. But when we come to the Bible as an ancient countercultural invitation offers something totally different to us, and it can be summed up in the word Sabbath. It was Jesus who famously said, "Come to me, all who labor and are heavy laden." Imagine he's speaking this directly to you. Come to me, all who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. I don't think I need to present the argument that we desperately crave that kind of rest. Most of us are living total opposite of that, where we are living these lives that are consumed by physical and mental exhaustion. It might be as a result of a lack of sleep or a demanding season of life or our always-on work culture, or it could be some of you that are juggling multiple jobs just to stay afloat in this economy. The truth is that many of us live with this sense of low-grade exhaustion, and we just feel like we're on the edge of physical or mental breakdown. The truth is, we need rhythms to support our lives. We need them. In the book, A Hidden Wholeness, the author Parker Palmer talked about Midwestern farmers who, when they were preparing for blizzards that could come upon them fiercely and they wouldn't even know they were coming, they would tie a rope to their back door out to their shed, and this would serve as an anchor point of safety for them. They could go out in the blizzard and they could know that they would have a way to get back to safety. And these people would speak of the intensity of these blizzards when the wind was blowing at full force. They said they couldn't even see their hands in front of them. And there are accounts of people who would wander in circles in their own land because they didn't know where they were going, and they would die. And these ropes would serve as an anchor point of rescue, guiding many people back to safety. And I want to propose to you guys that these practices we're talking about, these ancient practices that Jesus modeled, they are ropes leading back to God in this whiteout blizzard that we call life. These are not just life-giving practices, they are in a true sense life-saving, and we need them. And today we're going to consider together what it means to practice the Sabbath. Sabbath is an ancient practice that's been received as a gift from humans for over 3,500 years, and the word itself comes from the Hebrew Shabbat, and it simply means to stop, to cease, to hold off, to not do anything. There's nothing inherently sacred or holy about the word in and of itself, but when you look through the Bible at how it's used, you start to see that Sabbath has more flavor than just stopping from work. Sabbath can be defined as a 24-hour period of time in which we stop work, enjoy rest, remember and worship God, and practice delight. That's how we can define it. There's 4 movements of stop, rest, remember, and delight. Now, the Sabbath has been a hallmark of the Jews throughout their history, and this practice, maybe more than any other in Jewish practices, has kept them from the cultural forces that try to assimilate them. And for this reason, it's often been said that for 3,500 years, the Sabbath has kept the Jews more than the Jews have kept the Sabbath. And so Jesus, we get to Jesus, and he was, of course, a first century Jewish man who held a deep respect for the Jewish traditions, and so he had a respect for the Sabbath. And I think it goes back to his understanding that his Father, God, was the one to give us this gift of the Sabbath. God himself instituted it, and Jesus was the Son of God, and so he respected this idea. So we're going to go all the way back to the beginning of the Bible to figure out why did Jesus think the Sabbath was so important, and why is it important still for us today. Page 2 of the Bible, the creation account, Genesis chapter 2 says, "And on the 7th day, God finished his work that he had done." So he created the world in 6 days, and on the 7th day he finished it. It says he rested on the 7th day from all his work that he had done, and he blessed the 7th day and made it holy, because on it God rested from all his work that he had done in creation. And I want you to think about 2 words that have the potential to change your life forever. And the words are God rested. Just let that sink in. God himself, the ultimate sovereign, the king of all things, he rested. And when you dig into this creation account, there's a lot of evidence that the author was intentionally contrasting the way the Bible says the world was created with other creation accounts from the ancient Near East. And when you read those accounts, you find that their gods, the ancient Near Eastern deities, did not finish creation, and they did not rest. And so when they would have heard about the God of the Bible and read these texts, they would have been blown away to hear a God who says, "I rested and I finished creating the world." And my question for us, my question for myself, even as I was preparing for this, is if God rested, then why do I struggle so much with the idea of slowing down and resting? Why do I have a hard time agreeing with the idea that it is finished and I can rest? For me, maybe for you too, things rarely seem finished. When you get one thing done, it's on to the next thing. There's always another thing to do. And I think the creation account, it gives us an invitation to live like God lived. It gives us a template. God gave us a template. He wove it into the fabric and DNA of the creation of the universe and how he created each and every one of you. And the template is that we have permission to follow God's rhythms of work and rest. We don't have to work every single day. If God rested, then we can too. We're not God. So that's creation account. The next time you see the Sabbath talked about is in the 10 Commandments. And there's 2 different recordings of the 10 Commandments, and they're similar, but there's a couple of key differences. The first one is Exodus chapter 20, where God says, "Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the 7th day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter or your male servant or your female servant or your livestock or the sojourner who is within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea and all that is in them, and rested on the 7th day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy." Let's think about this for a minute. God said the Sabbath is holy. What does that mean? To be holy means to be dedicated to God, to be given over to the purposes of God. So a common object could be made holy if it was dedicated for God's purpose. So for the Sabbath to be holy means it is a day dedicated to the Lord. It's not a day to just do whatever you want to do and do the things that you find joy in. It's a day given over to God. The Sabbath also includes worship. Even in this text, you see this idea of communal worship, of a family, a household, a community of people gathering together to remember and celebrate and worship God. And this is hard for us because we have this idea in our individualized culture that Sabbath is just for our restoration. But that would have been foreign to the Bible's view on what Sabbath is. And this is one of my personal barriers to being able to Sabbath in what might be a more biblical and proper way. If you're like me, you might have a job where you're giving a lot of relational energy. And if you're like me, being around a lot of people doesn't exactly restore your energy level. I love being around people. I'm extroverted in that sense, but I need to pull back so that I can restore myself. I need times alone in the morning, and I struggle when I wake up and the kids are up and it's immediate boom, 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 everything. I just get really overwhelmed. I need that time. So if you're like me, it's really tempting to see the Sabbath as something that is very individual, very personalized to you and you alone. And that wouldn't have been the view. The view for them would have been this idea that you need to gather with a community of people, maybe your family or extended family or friends or whatever, your network, to be able to remember and worship God together. The Sabbath was not meant to replace your individual daily time with Jesus, where you're listening to him, reading about him, loving him, praying to him, hearing his voice guide you. The Sabbath was not meant to replace that any more than this weekly gathering was meant to replace that. This isn't going to be enough, right? To sustain our souls in daily living, we need rhythms. We need rhythms, daily and weekly rhythms, where we are listening to God individually, gathering corporately, but also Sabbathing together to hear what God has to say there. And so they would have included, it says that they included sons and daughters and servants and animals and even sojourners outside their gate. And the question is why? Why would they do this? Why would they include multiple people? And I wonder if the idea of having multiple people Sabbath together is so that the community of people could protect each other from the threat of putting their identity in what they produce. Does that make sense? In other words, the community holds each other accountable to not overwork, but to follow God's rhythms of work and rest. It's really fascinating. This was John Goldingay. He had this quote that just pierced me this week. He was talking about how the animals and the sojourners are included in this list of people that were meant to Sabbath. And he said, these are the more marginal people. And then he said, if we, as a community, don't make it possible for people to feed their families without working 7 days a week, in our own way, we are breaking the Sabbath. That's intense. And most of us have not considered that kind of communal view. It's really, really foreign to us. But let me go a little deeper and hang with me here. This just gets more and more compelling to me, because in this account in Exodus 20, what was the motivation to Sabbath? It was you Sabbath because God Sabbath. He created the world in 6 days. On the seventh day, he rested. But in the other account of the Ten Commandments, talking about the command to Sabbath, there's a different motivation. This is Deuteronomy 5. It starts out almost the same. It says observe the Sabbath rather than remember the Sabbath, but everything is the same. All the same people are supposed to Sabbath. But then it says, you shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God brought you out from there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore, the Lord your God commanded you to keep the Sabbath day. So here the motivation is that you should remember that your ancestors were slaves in Egypt and that God rescued them. What's going on here? If you remember the account where God's people for over 10 generations were trapped in Egypt, and Pharaoh, the slave master, worked them to the bone. That's all they did. 7 days a week they were working. That's all they knew. Their parents, great-grandparents, grandparents, great-great-grandparents, everybody in their family was known only for what they produced. But God rescued them. And now I think the call to remember this slavery and redemption as a motivation to keep Sabbath, I think that was a call for all future generations, including ours, to resist the oppression that Pharaoh modeled. And I think our revolutionized culture really needs to hear those words, because we are more like enslaved Israel than we like to admit. Think about it. How many of you guys have external pharaohs that are driving you? Things or people or cultural forces that are telling you, whispering in your ear, your value is only in what you produce, and you're worthless unless you work hard and accomplish your goals. And the idea is that when we refuse to succumb to those pressures of the culture around us and the systems that try to oppress people into working all the time, we too, just like Israel, serve as a sign of a free people, a people freed by God. And now for some of us, the pressure may not be external, but maybe it's the internal Pharaoh who's constantly telling you you're not good enough. You haven't accomplished enough. Nobody will care for you or love you unless you do X, Y, and Z, whatever it is. There's external pharaohs, there's internal pharaohs, and I really, really believe that there are spiritual forces of darkness that want to distort your views of work and rest and drive you away from the rest that Jesus is offering you. Just as the creation account was pointing the gun at the ancient Near Eastern deities, saying that's not how it is, I think the words of the Ten Commandments were coming straight at the Egyptian Pharaoh and all and every modern pharaohs that try to place your identity in what you produce over who you are and how you belong to God. Walter Brueggemann said, Sabbath becomes a decisive, concrete, visible way of opting for and aligning with the God of rest. And this is so much bigger than just individual refreshment. This is a societal vision for justice. This is a collective call for us to resist oppression that threatens to identify people according to anything other than who God says they are. And that's kind of the nutshell teachings on Sabbath in the Old Testament. So you fast forward, and by the time you get to Jesus, the laws were really, really convoluted. There were very stringent and picky requirements for what you could and could not do on the Sabbath day. And Jesus, doing what he often did, he kind of starts to reinterpret the boundary lines and the purpose of the Sabbath. And we don't have a lot of time to go into this. I highly encourage you. There's some extra resources in your note to check out. If you want to dig into this, the Bible Project has almost 15 hours worth of podcast content where they look through this theme of seventh-day rest through the Bible. And I think that Jesus saw himself as the ultimate fulfillment of the Sabbath. And that's why he could say, come to me and I will give you rest. It's not just a one-day rest. This is a deep rest for your soul that lasts forever. Jesus believed that to enter into his rest was similar to entering into the wholeness and peace of the new creation and what God was offering all of us. So in the classic account of Jesus and the Sabbath in Mark chapter 2, it says, one Sabbath, he, being Jesus, was going through the grain fields, and as they made their way, his disciples began to pluck heads of grain. And the Pharisees were saying to him, look, why are they doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath? And Jesus said to them, have you never read what David did when he was in need and was hungry? He and those who were with him, how he entered the house of God in the time of Abiathar the high priest and ate the bread of the presence, which it is not lawful for any but the priest to eat, and also gave it to those who were with him. Like he's just laying it on thick to these guys. And then Jesus said to them, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man, which is what he referred to himself as, is Lord even of the Sabbath. Jesus seemed less concerned with the particular do's and don'ts on the Sabbath day and more concerned about two overarching principles. And the first principle is, does your Sabbath honor Jesus as Lord? The early Christian confession in the Greco-Roman world was Jesus is Lord. That's what they would say. And there was a subtle little tag-along where when people said Jesus is Lord, they were also saying, and Caesar, therefore, is not. It was their way of coming against the power of the day. And I think it's the same for us. When we practice Sabbath, it's our way of saying Jesus is Lord, Pharaoh is not. The modern pharaohs have no power. So Jesus was concerned, does the Sabbath honor him as Lord? And two, is the Sabbath acting as a gift to people? He said the Sabbath was made for you guys. You guys weren't made for the Sabbath. It was meant to be a gift that is received with open arms, a blessing to you. It's not something that you have to work for. It's not something that you have to earn. And I've talked to some people who struggle with this idea. They feel like they can't Sabbath unless they've given all of themselves. They've got to work hard enough. They've got to deserve the Sabbath or vacation. So they've got to be totally exhausted before they can take it. And if this is you, I think it can help to understand that the Sabbath is not just a day off. Right? We're not talking just a day off where you're focused on what is good for you. Eugene Peterson said that a day off is a bastard Sabbath. I think that's hilarious. Like an illegitimate Sabbath, a wannabe. It's got some good things about it. You can be very productive and refreshed on a day off, but it just doesn't hit the standard of what Sabbath was trying to do. Sabbaths are not to recharge you so that you can go back to work more efficient and effective. They're not to pursue selfish delights that are disconnected from God. The Sabbath is a time to cultivate your closeness with Jesus and be refreshed by him, to delight in his creation and his love for you so that you can grow in your capacity to live from that fullness every day. It's hard to measure, but it's a time when we remember that God finished the work of creation and Jesus finished the work of redemption. And all of our work, well, it's kind of secondary to that. So that's the case for Sabbath. Now, how do we do it? How do we Sabbath together? How do we practice this? There's 5 elements that I have that I hope will provide a framework for you and be helpful on how to Sabbath. The first one is prepare for it. The Jewish people would have a day of preparation the day before the Sabbath. It was something they looked forward to in their week, and they prepared for it. And I think it's the same for us. We have to be able to prepare for the Sabbath. It's not going to happen. Preparing for it looks like, 1, finding a time to actually do it. Traditionally, they would look at their calendar, and a day would be evening to evening. And so the traditional Sabbath would be Friday evening to Saturday evening. Now, for most people in our modern work cultures, that's kind of hard. So a lot of people will do a weekend day when they're off, or if you work on the weekends, you might choose a day during the week. Like my Sabbath is on Friday, and that's the day that's dedicated to that. So you want to pick a time, and if you can't pick a whole 24 hours, we'll speak into that in just a minute. But even if you have something carved out in your calendar, that's a starting point. If it's not in my calendar, it's not going to happen. Second thing that might be helpful is you choose a ritual to begin and end your Sabbath. And this is something that our family has never actually done. I've never done any kind of ritual other than maybe turning on the vacation reminder on my email. But it can be helpful for your mind to mentally kind of accept that now we are entering into the day of Sabbath. And so there's some ideas in the bulletin QR code on different rituals and stuff. And the third thing you want to do is prepare for resistance, because you're going to have it. You're going to have internal resistance. Maybe this isn't going to work. Am I wasting my time? You're going to have external resistance, the phone, emails, calls, and texts, all the demands and chores of daily living. And you're going to have spiritual resistance. You're going to have forces of darkness coming against you, because to give a day over to Jesus, to Sabbath in the Lord, is truly an assault on the kingdom of darkness. And so there are going to be spiritual forces coming against you, but you want to prepare for it. Second thing you do is you stop. Now, the standard for stopping is you stop for a full 24 hours from all paid and unpaid work. All right, now there's some leniency here. Jesus was clearly in that story we just told. He had his disciples eating, picking grain, working on the Sabbath. In another account, he was healing on the Sabbath. So it's not stop being a good person, stop everything. It's you can find out what is paid and unpaid work, what are the things that you need to stop from that can really allow your body to relax. And there's some unpaid work that just frankly never stops. Now, in our family, Lauren and I have a tradition where on the Sabbath day, because we don't want to change diapers, that's work for us, the kids go with no diapers. Is it inconvenient the next day to clean their poop up off the ground? Yeah. Is it disgusting when they crawl through it and they're eating it and smearing? It's not my love language, but it's worth it. I'm just kidding. That would not be worth it. There's some work you just can't stop from. You have to do some things, and that's fine. The key here, guys, the key is to start to identify rhythms. Rhythms in your daily life, your weekly life, your yearly life, where you can stop and unplug and truly experience the rest that God wants to give you. Now, if you can't devote a full 24 hours to it, maybe you're in a demanding season of life, maybe you're going through something and you're like, I just don't have that to give, start with a few hours. Carve out a few hours in your day. I'm thinking of my wife, if you're a parent who's staying at home and homeschooling and just busy and up to your eyeballs in kids and their everything, maybe you carve out a few minutes a few times a day. Maybe you take mini Sabbaths in your day. It's starting somewhere. It's the idea of letting your body learn that it operates according to rhythms of work and rest. And we need those rhythms to sustain ourselves. So you want to start small. My Sabbaths are not perfect. I struggle at times to give a whole, I don't even know if I've given a whole 24 hours in this biblical sense. So there's definitely been long stretches, but it's really, really difficult for me, partly because of the season of life I'm in. I may step away from work for a day and stop that, but the anxiety that drives it feels like it's still right there with me. It's hard to decrease that anxiety in just one day. And so I got into the habit of seeing my vacations as mini sabbaticals or extended Sabbaths. And we joke in our house because of the first 3 or 4 days of vacation, I just wander around the house aimlessly. Like, who am I? What am I? What am I doing? Like, and it's because my body literally needs to decompress. All of the adrenaline, all of the stress just needs to calm down. And I need to actually learn how to relax and rest. And so, my Sabbath yesterday is a good example. It was Friday, not yesterday. I spent half of my Sabbath Friday morning freaking out because we've got these cracks coming out of our windows in one of our rooms, and it's an indication of structural damage. And so I'm doing all this research and freaking out about it, and I'm not having a Sabbath dedicated to the Lord because I'm not trusting God. I'm not delighting in God. I'm not remembering what He's done for me. I'm definitely not resting. And I've stopped from my paid work, but I feel like there's a lot I got to take care of here, so I wasn't even stopping. And then I remembered what someone said in life group this week. They said how they've been getting into the practice of taking all of their stressors and anxieties and taking them to Jesus and saying, Jesus, are you worried about this? And so I did that. I took the cracks to God, and I said, God, are you worried about these cracks in our foundations? And you want to know what He said? He said, yeah, your house is going to slide off its foundation and kill you. No, he didn't. Of course not. I had a mental image of just, just like, not the disappointment, but just the humor. Like when a child's just like, are you worried? And it's like, oh, come on. No, I've got this. He's got this. He cares about us. So if He has this taken care of, and if He's not worried, why do I struggle to stop? Why do we struggle to stop? I think one reason is no matter what season of life you're in, there's always something to do. There's always something. If you're a student, maybe you're overwhelmed by homework and sports activities and keeping up with friendships. And I think of the people that got pulled into, or maybe still pulled into, the Snapchat streaks, where you have to keep a streak going with multiple friends every day. And it's just unreal to me, like, how invested you have to be to keep things going. Like, that takes mental energy to do that. When you're getting a new job, you're invested there. When you start a family, when you have children that have all these activities, and when you're launching them out into the world, that, like, every season of life has something to do. There's always an excuse to not Sabbath. But the truth is, and I've heard this from clinical psychologists who work with CEOs and lawyers and doctors and people who lead these very fast-paced lives, they say, well, you actually won't stop because you can't stop. Like, your body is so wired from the fast-paced life you're living of just going. To stop feels like death. To stop, you might physically get sick because you've just been in this mode of pushing for so long. Many of us don't stop because we can't stop. And for some, maybe some here today, deep down, if you do stop, it means that you have to face the things that you've been hiding from, the things that you've been covering up and burying with work and activity. And I think there are two core spiritual issues here when it comes to stopping. And the first one is facing reality, and the second one is trusting God. We will not Sabbath. I will not Sabbath if I'm afraid of what I will find when I stop, and I will not Sabbath if I refuse to trust God to care for me and to still accomplish things, even when it looks like I'm not. So when we stop, the third element is we rest. We prepare, we stop, and we rest. And I'm talking rest for your body, rest for your mind, rest for your soul. And the question here is, do you believe that God wants you to rest? Do you believe that? Deep down, do you trust that he wants you to experience rest? And on the one hand, I think, well, the answer's got to be yes. He designed us to be able to sleep for a large chunk of our lives. Like, clearly, he cares about rest. But on the other hand, the cultural quip is, well, I'll rest when I'm dead. And that's still such a popular thing. And for many people, we don't rest until our bodies give out and the illness hits, the diagnosis comes, and now we're forced to rest. And that's the only time we'll do it. And part of me gets it. Part of me understands. Because to a world without the influence of Jesus, a full 24-hour period where you don't work just looks ludicrous. It's like, why would you want to be that unproductive? There's things to do. You know, what's that song? There's bills to pay, mouths to feed. Like, I don't even remember what song it is. But the idea is God cares about the iceberg. And it's this image here. God cares about the iceberg of your life because your life is like that picture right there, where the top of the iceberg above the water, that's the 10% of your life that everyone can see, but the bottom parts are there driving. They're the force behind your life. And they are being developed consciously when you put your attention and focus on certain things, but that underneath of the iceberg is also being developed subconsciously, especially when you rest. I remember hearing a podcast a while back where they were talking about these high-level Olympic athletes and what distinguishes them from other kinds of athletes. And what they said was, it's actually not the quality of their practice, it's the quality of their rest that makes a difference. And studies have affirmed this. Studies of over 3,000 different athletes found that once you hit a certain level in your performance, your amount of practice only accounts for about a 1% difference in your quality of athleticism. The rest of it comes from taking care of yourself, good diet, good rest. People talk about Olympic athletes I read talking about taking naps during the day after they slept for 9 hours at night because it was that important to let their bodies heal and grow stronger. So that's incredible to me. God is not a Pharaoh. He's a God of rest, and he wants you to rest. So the fourth thing we do is we remember. There's a lot of ways you can do this. In your notes, I refer you to that for different ideas. The ancient wisdom has been to remember two key things. One, God's work in creation, and two, Jesus' work in redemption. So we remember how God created the world. We bask in that. We remember his goodness in creating the world, and we remember how God redeemed Israel out of the slavery of Egypt and how Jesus saved us, and we just meditate on these things. And the core issue here is your identity. When you stop, you don't have the influence of work. You don't have the influence of all the things pouring into you constantly. So what is going to fill that void? Whatever is there is going to shape your identity. And if it's not God, it will be something else. So we prepare, we stop, we rest, we remember. And the last element is we delight. And this is neglected. I'm not honestly sure why this is neglected. My sense is I don't know that I've met many followers of Jesus who their mental picture of God is one who's like smiling and filled with joy and delight and just like happy to do life with you. I think most people have this picture of this kind of slave driver, this begrudging, well, you know, I love you because I have to, but I don't really like you, you know, and I'm not sure if that's part of it, but this is a neglected piece. And the idea is that when God created the world, what did he do? He stepped back and he said, wow, that's really, really good. I love that. I delight in that. And he delights in us. And he calls us to do the same, delight in him. There's been a huge buzz in the past 20 years or so on how play and delight and joy actively shape your brain. And what studies have found is that children need delight and play and joy for proper development. If you take those things away, it just dries out the soul. There was one doctor, he wrote this book, Play, how it shapes the brain, opens up the imagination, and invigorates the soul. And he's given his life to researching play. And he said the opposite of work, or the opposite of play is not work. The opposite of play is depression. That's incredible to me. God is a God of delight, a God of laughter, a God of fun and enjoyment. And he's calling you to delight in him. I'm going to invite the band up. In all of these practices, we want to remind you guys of the J curve of change. If you've never seen that before, it looks like this image here. And it's the theory that whenever you embark on a new adventure where you're trying to practice a new habit or change something in your life, typically it goes like a J, where things get worse before they get better. You encounter a lot of resistance early on when you try to make changes, and it can make it really defeating. And this is where most people just give up. They walk away. They say, this isn't for me, but it's worth it to stick with it. You need to work through the resistance because Sabbath is hard. And if you put this into practice and you weren't before, you're going to face the feeling of maybe this is a waste. This feels like an interruption to my day and the rhythms that I've been accustomed to, but it's worth it to face the resistance, to let your body learn a new rhythm of work and rest so that you can trust Jesus more. Our big idea is that Sabbath is a gift. It's a gift to you. It's a gift to me. Our challenge is take a step towards regularly practicing the Sabbath. It doesn't have to be the full 24 hours if you're not there yet. Just take a step to where you prepare for it. You stop, you rest, you remember God, and you delight in